Hello. We're going to get started into the next presentation. Now we have a keynote from Carissa Christensen. She serves as the managing partner for the Tauri Group, and she'll be speaking about the future of the space market. Please welcome Carissa Christensen.
Thank you. Thank you. So, we have heard some really interesting talks today about NASA and what NASA is doing and the opportunities on that side of the future of space. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the business side of space and the emerging future space opportunities and space markets, particularly focused on suborbital reusable vehicles. And one of the reasons that I think that is interesting to people who are starting their careers in space and seeking to build careers in space is that the good folks at Virgin Galactic, for example, point out that to date, maybe 500 people have gotten to space. Once they start flying, they hope to have 500 people in space in a year or two, and thousands after that. So it really is potentially a game changer, potentially a different kind of an opportunity, a massive increase in the number of people that can go to space. And so the question that, were I in your shoes, starting my career in this industry, and I envy you doing that, I would be asking is how real is it, and what is actually going to happen? And so that's what I'm going to talk to you about. That's what we've studied, and I'm going to offer you some thoughts that I and my firm have put together about suborbital reusable space vehicles and the associated markets. So the whole point of this study that we did, and one of the fun things that I get to do in my job, is to go around and ask people what's going on and then say, prove it. And that's particularly important whether your background, whether your skill set is engineering, whether it's business focused, whether it's communications oriented. As the space industry evolves, that tell me what's going on and prove it is going to be an important part of how you evaluate companies and opportunities and trends in the industry. So we did this study to help decision makers now at the FAA, which has to regulate the industry, at organizations like Space Florida, which is an economic development group that funded this along with FAA, that's making decisions about how to support this industry. This study is aimed at helping those folks as well as helping companies, particularly smaller companies in the marketplace, understand what the market is and where it's going. So right now there are more than a dozen companies globally developing or working on or planning or talking about suborbital reusable vehicles. So these are basically launch vehicles that will go into space, cross the 100-kilometer threshold, provide passengers or cargo 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 minutes of weightlessness, afford a view of the curvature of the Earth and the blackness of space, and then return. So it's a very different experience from Dr. Whitson's 6 months on the space station, but it's access to space. It's not a simulation. It's the real deal. The companies that are doing this range from companies. There's some commonalities in some of the owners or motive forces behind these companies. There is, for example, Sir Richard Branson, who I know you've seen in commercials, floating around in a simulated space environment, who is the head of the Virgin Group, which is the primary motive force behind Virgin Galactic, one of the key players that grew out of the winner of the X Prize competition. There's also a company called Blue Origin, which is the company started by Jeff Bezos, who is the head of Amazon. And he also has a large fortune developed in the non-space arena that he is applying to space. There's a company called XCore. That's a company run by entrepreneurial engineers with a history in various launch companies and startups who are very well respected in the industry. There's also a company called Armadillo, Armadillo Aerospace. John Carmack, who's a video game developer known for Doom and Quake, is the head of that organization. There's a company called Maston Space Systems. Dave Maston made his achieved his career success in Silicon Valley. There's even a small company in New Mexico that's launching usables, and they've actually been launching for a few years. So there's an industry that's actually getting started, and mostly the money for it has come from outside of the space industry, which is very unusual for space ventures. And there's been an awful lot of discussion over the last 3, 4, 5, 6 years as these companies develop this capability and talk about the opportunity to launch people in space, not simply NASA-selected astronauts, but people who can afford a ticket. There's been an awful lot of talk about what those vehicles can do. And so the purpose of the study that we did was to really try to look with a certain degree of rigor at what those markets are and help people understand what suborbital reusable vehicles can do and what the likely market is and what it would take to change that market, to see it grow, what threats there might be to it. So we looked at 8 areas. Commercial human spaceflight, that is the one that I think is the where $100,000 a ticket, and you fly for the joy of it, for the excitement of it, for the adventure of it. There are a number of people in countries that don't have space programs who bought tickets so they can be the first person from their country to go to space. There's also been, particularly in the last 2 to 3 years, you may have some connectivity to it through the Suborbital Researchers Conference that has started to take place annually over the last few years. The idea that these vehicles, particularly if they're frequently launching passengers, can also be used for research. And so one of the big questions there is, what research can you actually do with 5 minutes of microgravity on a suborbital vehicle? What's realistic? Who's going to pay for it? Is there really a market? I'll talk a little bit about that. Third, a related piece of that is you're actually going to do engineering tests. So you've designed a piece of hardware and you need to demonstrate it in the space environment. Suborbitals may let you do that in a much less expensive way than, for example, finding a ride to station. There's also the media and PR opportunity, and that is everything people have talked about, everything from wrapping vehicles to with logos or advertisements, to doing reality shows, to documentaries, and so on. There's education, and that's fairly obvious. There's deploying very small satellites, and that's an interesting growing area. There are also 2 markets, we looked at this over a 10-year time frame, that don't appear to be viable in the 10-year time frame. One is remote sensing, that is using these vehicles for imaging, and there are satellites, and there are aircraft, and there are UAVs that already do remote sensing and are so effective in that marketplace, it doesn't appear suborbitals have a compelling role. And then there's point-to-point transportation, which Dr. O talked about and showed video of the work that the folks at Langley are doing, and that video had a picture of the Concorde in it. One of the challenges, there are 2 challenges there. There are technology challenges and there are market challenges. So in a 10-year time frame, we don't think point-to-point transportation is a likely application. But there are some really interesting ones that do exist. A quick note on how we did this. We talked to more than 100 people. We surveyed wealthy people about their intent and interest in buying tickets. We did scenario-based forecasting, and the whole point of the work that my company does is that our work is rigorous and objective and provides insight into areas of uncertainty to help people formulate their decisions for the future. We looked at a baseline scenario that says, what would happen if everything stayed the same as it is today? We looked at a growth scenario, and I will tell you every company in the industry would say that growth scenario is the right one because that assumes we can change the way people in our customers think. We can affect their excitement about this and their interest in the market, and there's absolutely truth to that. We also looked at a constraint scenario. What happens if things change? Does this market go away completely? Does it have durability? So perhaps the most interesting finding of this whole study was that commercial human spaceflight, this idea of participants who are doing this for themselves, drives this market. that there appear thousands of people right now who have the interest, and we tested interest with a survey instrument that was pretty rigorously designed to ensure that people were deeply interested, and that have the money. We surveyed people who've got a net worth of $5 million and more, so that we asked people what they had spent in the past, and we asked people what was the most they would spend on a dream vacation, a dream trip or vacation. And based on that analysis, with a really critical lens, it appears that at the prices that companies are talking about, and the prices they're talking about are at the high end, $200,000 a ticket. At the low end, I think it's 92, it may be 98, $100,000 a ticket. That there's a real, immediate, meaningful audience, a meaningful demand for those services. That is unprecedented in the space industry. The only place in space that is driven by commercial activity as opposed to government activity is satellite telecommunications. That has evolved to the point where the real money there is associated with television and with internet and with GPS applications. So that market, which is quite mature, it's been around for decades, is driven by commercial use. But there's no part of the broader space industry, the space transportation industry, that has ever been driven by the dollars associated with commerce alone. So this is really extraordinary and unique, and it is transformative for the future of space as you look at it and as you see it playing out, because the decision makers, the people who are going to affect what happens, are not necessarily going to be the people in government agencies. They're not necessarily going to be people working for companies who are working for government agencies. They're going to be people who are entrepreneurs, they're going to be people, business people, they're going to be the consumers demanding those services. It's a very different dynamic, and I think a very interesting one. Also, another thing that we found that I'll note is that, not surprisingly, as prices go down, interest goes up. But also, if prices go up from currently proposed levels, from currently announced levels, there's still some meaningful demand. So, again, in the space industry, demand is usually the question mark, and here there's robust demand. So the question mark now becomes, when is the supply going to be available? And I know you're going to have an opportunity to ask some questions of representatives of some of those companies this afternoon. And it's a very exciting time. So let's see if we can. And that's not wanting to switch forward. I swear I have more things to say. All right, AV folks, I could use some help. We're not moving forward. Okay, well that was backwards. Okay, there we go. So we have lots of underlying data associated with these surveys. One I thought you'd be interested in, because I know that no one in this group falls into this category, is why people that we surveyed said they didn't want to go to space. And those reasons ranged from that, about half of people that we surveyed just sort of a priori said, yeah, I just don't think so. And the reasons were interesting. Some of them were, I just had no interest in spaceflight, ranging to others that were, that's not spaceflight enough. The 5 minutes is not what I want to do. Some perception of risk. Generally speaking, we were interested to find that perceptions of risk were not a major driver for decision making to the degree that we thought they might be, although they certainly affected some significant portion of the population. So that's 80%. That's the big piece of the pie. That's where the dollars are coming from. If, and I hope when, this industry emerges, people buying tickets, typically wealthy people, although not all wealthy people. I will tell you that the companies view the opportunity, view their customer base as being much broader than the very wealthy. And so, and certainly have had some experience of people buying tickets who have fewer assets than you would expect. But in our view, the motive force, the big engine is the wealthy at those prices, or high net worth individuals. So, given then that there's that market, there's that demand, that creates an opportunity to do certain kinds of research. Suddenly you have vehicles and capability, and so the question is, what kind of research can you do in that time frame with that capability? is there really anything that you can do with 5 minutes with, up and back, not achieving orbit? And it turns out there are a few areas that are really, really well suited to these vehicles. And again, our frame of reference was proven, so what we looked at was not brand new programs that the government would have to start up. We're in a constrained budget environment. There's always a slow period in starting up anything new in terms of government programs, and now even more so. So we looked at what's the government currently paying for. And there are 4 areas that are really interesting for suborbitals. Those are atmospheric research, that idea that you want to kind of get to the high atmosphere and you want to get to it frequently. So you don't necessarily want to buy a rocket to go up there to do every take every instrument up, but if you can put an instrument on flights that are going weekly or daily, you can get a huge amount of data very cost effectively. And that would be a superior platform to anything that's currently available. And NOAA is already spending money on doing related research. There is astronomy, getting outside the atmosphere to the UV and IR spectra, and typically you need a dedicated launch, a dedicated suborbital vehicle to do that, but potentially you could do that at a much lower cost and with much more flexibility than using an orbital asset like Hubble or eventually James Webb. There is longitudinal human research. So that gets back to that point I made earlier, that idea that we've had a very small number of people, relatively speaking, go to space. And suddenly, if you've got dozens of people a week, if you've got hundreds of people a year or even more flying, the data that you can get, and that's a much more diverse pool. That's a self-selected pool of people who say, I can put cash on the barrelhead, as opposed to people who've gone through the astronaut selection process we heard about this morning. So that's a much broader and more differentiated data set of the impacts on humans in space. And there are apparently some really interesting effects. Your vascular system responds, your immune system responds to that acceleration and then that microgravity in a very short period of time. And then also you've got crew members. A couple of these vehicles actually have crew that fly with each flight. Those crew members who are flying over and over. So you can get the same person who's flying perhaps weekly, which we have never had data on before. So, and then the fourth area, which is microgravity, is the one that everybody kind of focuses on, and it's actually the hardest one to sort of find a compelling story about. So in terms of capability, the idea that you'll use a suborbital vehicle, there's a nice combination of capabilities. You can put a person in there, so you don't have to automate an experiment. You can put a fairly large experiment in there. You've got some frequency of flight. The cost is relatively low. It's quite low compared to space station, although it's higher compared to, say, a drop tower or a parabolic, a plane that simulates microgravity. But that combination of attributes is a good fit for certain experiments. The difficulty right now is that the money for microgravity research on the government side in the US is pretty thin. There's a good bit of interest in Europe. There's actually potential interest in other countries that don't have space programs, and we do think that that'll grow, but we think that that'll take a while. It takes a while for research communities to ramp up, so they're going to need to see some results. There's going to need to be publications. They need to go through the peer review process. That's going to need to get into government budget cycles. So we actually think it'll take 6 or 7 years for other countries to really get programs in place to take advantage of these vehicles. But once they do, that'll grow, and in 15 or 20 years, you might see other companies spending substantially more than the US does on microgravity research on suborbitals. Aerospace technology tests and demo. So to those of you in the engineering field, probably have some familiarity with technology maturity levels, this idea that as you develop a new technology, there are metrics and standards that are relatively broadly used for how mature the technology is. And in space, the hard one is to get to TRL6, where you demonstrate your technology, your hardware, your system, your subsystem, your component, in an operationally relevant environment, meaning you've got to get it to space. That's hard, and it's expensive. And opportunities to do it are unpredictable. One of the really attractive potential capabilities of suborbital vehicles is for certain types of applications, you may be able to take advantage of that frequent flight and demonstrate your hardware. And so one of the interesting questions that arose out of this study is, what are the rules of the road at NASA and within the DoD and in other organizations for what they consider to be space qualified? Does 5 minutes count? Is that sufficient? What do they need to know about what suborbitals can do? So that's sort of evolving. And NASA has a program called the Flight Opportunities Program that actually is designed to support the use of suborbitals for this purpose. Media and public relations, hugely unpredictable, probably the market that I would say there's the most uncertainty about in every one of these markets. And by the way, if you're desperately interested in learning more about this, there's a 100-page report on our website and FAA's website and Space Florida's website that goes through all this detail. The purpose of this is to provide information that's useful. Media and PR, your first thought is sort of, wow, film movies in microgravity. Yeah, it's never going to happen. It's unlikely to happen. You're going to use simulated technologies. You're going to use green screens. You're going to use CGI. It's much cheaper. It looks just as real. But what we did find was interest from reality shows, from documentary filmmakers, and the average budget for a documentary is $250,000, which is not a very big budget. So even for a documentary, you're probably not going to see multiple dedicated flights. You might see cameras capturing flights that are going. Every company we talked to said, oh, we've gotten calls. We've gotten surprising, interesting calls from people who want to do PR or media, and it'll be interesting to see what deals actually close. So right now, there's lots of talk and lots of buzz, and some deals closing, but also uncertain potential. Education's really interesting. This is not NASA paying a university to do research. This is actually education for education's sake and using space assets. The interesting thing here is that for a cube size payload, 10 centimeters by 10 centimeters, that can actually be within the price range of a school, an elementary school. One of the senior executives at XCOR said it's sort of bake sale size, and that's exactly right, that it's within their budget and again, provides a different kind of opportunity for schools than existing programs where the space station has some great programs for schools. It costs a lot, up to $20,000, and you never know when you're going to get to fly. So you certainly can't build that into your curriculum. One of the opportunities with suborbitals is that semester after semester, you would predictably have access. Satellite deployment. So one of the emerging new markets, one of the emerging new space trends right now that I would commend to all of you to the extent that you're not aware of it, although I suspect you're pretty aware, is the emergence of small satellites ranging from CubeSats, which are producible with a kit, to, we looked at satellites under 15 kilograms. And the growth in demand for those satellites, the growth in launch activity for those satellites has been really marked. They've moved out of the realm of just sort of experimental, let's see, into some operational objectives for government agencies and some really increase in what I would call garage inventors and individual maker community members. So there's potential there. XCOR has come out and said that they originally announced 2017 will have the next generation of their launch vehicle that could launch a small satellite for about $500,000, which is a very attractive price for a dedicated launch of a satellite of that size. Virgin Galactic is part of a DARPA program to actually use their plane, the White Knight 2, as a platform for launching small satellites. So that's potentially very, very interesting and I think an unexpected market area for suborbitals. So, and I think I've covered that. So, just to give you the big picture, again, to reiterate what I said before, the majority of this demand is that big teal chunk of the pie. More than 80% is individuals buying tickets. And then a reasonable size associated with basic and applied research. But again, it's an unusual industry in that the government research community, the government-funded research community could actually benefit from commercially enabled capability, and that's exactly the opposite of what we have historically seen and really is a different way of thinking about how government and space interact for most people who've been in the space industry for a while. And this is our final forecast, our baseline, which again says, if everything goes on as it is today, and we look at the demand that really exists, we think there could be hundreds of launches per year. In that growth scenario, there could be more than 1,000 launches per year. And even if there is a significant economic contraction, since that hits wealthy populations differentially, we still see some significant demand for launches. So that's my overview of what's going on with SRVs. I'll note again, I do think that this was a useful study for FAA, the Office of Commercial Space Transportation, which licenses rocket launches, and Space Florida to fund, so I want to thank them for that. And thank you for your attention, and if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Carissa, how do you go about interviewing the people with the $5 million range? Do you call them during dinner, or do you?
That's right.
Or was it a sit down, face to face? I was just curious.
It's a great question. That is actually quite challenging to get to that population. We contracted with a company who specializes in doing research in that population. We developed the survey instrument because, Alan, as you know, we're control freaks. And we worked with them on the survey process. So, for example, the person taking the survey didn't know it was about space for the first few questions. So when we asked, what's the most you would spend on your dream trip? They didn't know it was a space dream trip. So we tried to do things that helped us calibrate the realism of their responses. And then we used some demographic data in the survey to calibrate the realism, to ensure that the population we were surveying was the population we were targeting.
Hi, Nathan Wong from the X Prize Foundation. You showed the pie chart with the distribution of different projects.
Mm-hmm.
How does that pie graph change from year one when we're starting operations to maybe 5, 10 years later?
That's a great question. So one of the challenges that we have here, I have another version of this that we call the Great Wall of Demand, because it's just this. The dynamics of this market are really difficult to predict. There's demand right now, right this minute. There are something like 8,000 people, based on our analysis, really interested in going with the money and the so one of the big questions we had is, how do you spread that over time? And in our report, it shows all the different ways that could happen. It could start low and go high. It could have a very high initial level of activity and then slow down. It could be uneven, given how the market potentially plays out. There's so much uncertainty associated with that we used a relatively flat construct. And so, generally speaking, the distribution stays mostly the same, although the research piece grows over time and the education piece grows over time as those entrants, because of the dynamic that when organizations get involved, they stay involved, but it takes them a while to get there. So they're continually adding on. Whereas the demand for the consumer demand, we spread out relatively flat in the baseline and relatively flat in the growth, with the expectation that you could see it go from the baseline to the growth. So, great question.
And Carissa, was there any way to factor in how a fatal accident might impact the market? Did you look at that at all?
So another great question. We baselined in our analysis, because there's so much uncertainty, so we baselined 3 things. One is a perception of appropriate safety, and we didn't seek to quantify that. So the short answer is we did not estimate that impact, but I want to talk about that. We also baselined stable prices. And there certainly is, in a 10-year time frame, likely to be some price variation, which would then affect demand. We also baseline the idea that our forecast doesn't start until the beginning of routine launch operations. And given that this is a complex field of endeavor, it's difficult to predict exactly when the routine operations will be. On the safety issue, I've said this in a number of forums before. What was so striking about that question of what would happen if there was an accident is that almost everyone we interviewed felt strongly that that mattered. And no one that we interviewed was able to offer a data-driven, analytic view of the consequence of an accident, of the way to interpret what would happen. So my observation, and this is just my personal observation, is that people were tending to come to extreme, to take extreme positions in terms of their what-ifing. Well, gosh, an accident might kill the industry. And I think that that was happening because they felt it was important and they didn't have data on which to base that determination. And so I think that that's going to be an important question coming up in the next year or two.
Do you ever foresee this sub-orbital flight becoming more of a tool for the masses? Because I think you're surveying extremely wealthy individuals and you see an interest there, which is certainly valid. I'm a fan of sub-orbital flight, of course, but it doesn't seem like it's going to ever branch out beyond the ultra-wealthy.
So that's a really good question. So I would say the ultra-wealthy are in space have historically been the folks going to space station, right? Sarah Brightman just signed up for that. That's $50 million, and who knew you could make that on Broadway? But this is certainly 2 orders of magnitude better in terms of accessibility with regard to price. The question of whether prices will drop to the point where it's more like a plane flight as opposed to an extraordinary experience is really depends on the dynamics of the market as it grows. So if that growth scenario and beyond, and again, every company that you go talk to will tell you that they can envision growth far beyond what we've predicted if X happens and Y happens and Z happens, and they can talk to you about how they're trying to make that happen. So typically, the more activity you get, the more your fixed costs are reduced, and it'll drop to some extent. I think that if we saw $100,000 space flight, that would be extraordinary. That would be absolutely extraordinary. And the fact that companies are, seeing real investment, they're developing systems, they're testing them now, that we're actually on a pathway, not from one company, not from one individual who's either a visionary or crazy, which is how our industry has historically been defined, but multiple companies is really, it's game-changing in a way that I did not expect when I saw that X Prize competition won, and I think it's a tremendously exciting time for you all to be sitting here thinking about your careers, whether you're working on an orbital vehicle or whether you're working for one of these companies or whether you're working for a company like mine that goes around and tracks what's going on and tells that story. It's a really great story to be part of.
Did the survey do anything to incorporate individuals who might be interested in purchasing multiple tickets, for example, for family members?
So we assumed that it was one ticket, one flight per person because of the price, and we got pushback on that from the providers who said that they had some customers who were likely to fly more than once, and other customers that were likely to want to fly on more than one vehicle. So again, our job is to kind of assess analytically what's going to drive the market. And I think that what's going to drive the market at this point, at these prices, are individual purchases as opposed to multiple purchases by an individual. But there are already individuals that are in that category that I would say are outliers, and that certainly may change over time.
If it does become more mainstream, what would happen just in terms of like fuel allocation and resources? Like how would this be supported aside from all the pastoral acting or something?
Well, so that's a really good question. Here's why this is different from many space ventures. Is I can stand here and tell you, here are the customers. The people that support it are the people that built their businesses and sold them and have $10 million in the bank, the people that were shrewder in the parent department than I was. There is a big population of wealthy people in the US and outside the US, about 2/3 of the demand, that's ready to pay tickets. So essentially, in that respect, it is self-supporting. So that customer base is what's making this a viable business. And then those smaller pieces of the wedge, those are enabled by that customer base. And you're highlighting kind of the switch in how we think of space ventures. We typically think of space ventures as technologically that we need to find a financial engine for. And this market appears to be one where there's a financial engine to drive it if we can achieve the technological objectives that companies have said that they can achieve. Okay. Thank you all very much. I really enjoyed being here, and I wish you best of luck.